Welcome to Prague Process Policy Talk, looking into 2024, what migration dynamics and policy developments to expect. My name is Violeta Wagner. I am the Regional Portfolio Manager for the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region here at ICMPD. It is my privilege to moderate today's Prague Process discussion between our two distinguished panelists and guests who meet here in this format for the fourth time in a row. Let me introduce our guests. Jean-Louis de Brouwer is Director of the European Affairs Program at Egmont Institute. Previously, he also served as a director at the European Commission, where, amongst other responsibilities, he was also responsible for immigration, asylum, border, and visas policies. Our second panelist, Ralph Genetzke, is Director of the ICMPD Brussels Mission. Today, usually, traditionally, for the first time in a row, we will speak about main lessons of 2023, and our guests will share their expectations for 2024. Our policy talk follows the release of ICMPD's 2024 Migration Outlook, where you could find 10 migration trends to expect in 2024. And you can read this outlook at the ICMPD website. As usually, we start with a broad reflection on the last year. We would like to hear from our experts what they would remember from the last year, what main developments, key issues would influence the migration dynamics in 2024. And 1 year ago, at this policy talk, they were reflecting on 2022, which was the year when Russia's aggression against Ukraine was dominating during the policy discussion, policy talk. The experts also agreed that Europe was dealing with a so-called poly-crisis when already recovering, at that time being in a crisis situation, recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Europe had to deal with additional structural challenges, with increased arrival of migrants to Europe, with the consequences of the climate change, and many more. I have feeling impression that it's quite the same this year, probably in some situation. It even worsened because we saw new crises, new conflicts in 2023. We saw the flare-ups of the old conflicts, the external, international, and internal displacement of people was also increasing. We see the signs of intervening of geopolitics and migration. But first of all, I would like to ask our experts about their lessons learned from 2023. And I would start with you, Ralph. Last year, when Malin Frankenhäuser, who was moderating the session in February 2023, when she asked you about your key lessons learned from the last year, you actually started to respond that there is not much positive that you could remember from that year. And now I would like to ask you, do you still share that impression? What were the main key events that happened in 2023 that would influence the migration dynamics in 2024? Ralph?
Thank you. First of all, thanks for having us again. Actually, it's the fourth year, as it was pointed out. It's a pleasure to be here and nice to see that there are so many colleagues interested in our conversation. Now, I mean, you pointed out already quite a few things on what happened throughout last year, and I'm sorry to say that I think it is. I mean, looking at the bigger picture in Europe, around Europe, it is difficult to have a positive look back on the year 2023. And actually, when we start right at the beginning, like 1 year ago, not to forget, actually, we had the devastating earthquakes, for instance, in Turkey and parts also of Syria. I think which affected many of us, especially or even also us in ICMPD. We had last year actually Turkey as the chairman, as the chair of what we call the steering group of ICMPD. So we have a very close relationship to the Turkish authorities. So yeah, I mean, we started the year really with this devastating earthquake. But I think in general, I mean, as long as we have the Russian aggression against Ukraine and thereby war in Europe, I think it's difficult to have a positive outlook on what happened last year. We have, I mean, the other sides, we have conflict in the Middle East and so on, in the Sahel. I mean, it all comes to, and we come back to that probably, doesn't make for a good situation. Now, I think beginning of the year is still also a moment when let's be a little bit, positive and look at the different layers on also when we speak about more the political situation, but then more specifically about migration and mobility. I mean, we ended, and we'll come back to that. We ended the year, at the EU level with a political agreement on the long-awaited EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. And that was seen and I think is welcomed by many, and we'll come back to that in our discussion, but I think it has to be underlined. I mean, many expected that the pressure would be so big on all sides, be it member states, the European Parliament, to come to an agreement. So the details now are being worked out, but the political agreement is there, which I think for EU politics is in principle good. I think another development I wanted to say, I mean, which I find positive, and again, happy to come back to that, is that in many events, and when we are in member states in the EU, but also outside the EU, and the topic of labor migration, I think, has made it really on the agendas of all states because of the necessities in our labor markets. And I think that is a very welcome development, because I think it's fair to say that still some years ago, the overall focus, and to some extent it's still the case, is mainly on controlling irregular migration, on working on the asylum systems. But yeah, I think to realize the need for a proper labor migration policies, I think it's much more present in initiatives, legislative initiatives, other initiatives, which as it was in the past. And the last point, again, also to be positive, which I would like to share, is I think we have really to pay tribute also to the many people in the EU and other countries, but I know more what is happening sort of in the EU when it comes to integration measures. We speak about millions of people, be it from Ukraine, but also then big numbers from other countries. And a lot is still being done sort of at grassroots level, be either organized or private initiatives. And I'm saying that because I was actually impressed when I visited last year one initiative by ICMPD. It was in Berlin, where we are running what we call sort of consultation centers with Ukrainian staff for Ukrainians who had to flee to and now are in Berlin for consultations on very practical things with regard to their stay, with regard to dealing with the authorities in Berlin, and we have similar initiatives both in Poland and the Czech Republic. So I think at that level, one sees still actually a lot of energy, a lot of initiative. Despite budget constraints and so on. And I think, we shouldn't forget that when we speak, and also ICMPD as an intergovernmental organization, we look at very much state level and so on, but that level of the grassroots initiatives and the contributions to, what functions and in our countries, I think we should really not forget that.
Thanks a lot, Ralph, also for this positive lessons learned from the last year. And also thanks a lot for referring to the Ukrainian consultation centers, which is part of our project portfolio. It's Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. Indeed, we do run 2 more in addition to Berlin, one in Prague and another in Gdańsk. And also some of the lessons learned that you mentioned, we will indeed pick up later in our discussion. Thanks a lot for mentioning them. Jean-Louis, now I would ask you a similar question. Then again, you referred to your lessons learned from 2022. You actually last year started with the positive developments, positive lessons learned. You mentioned that despite all the challenges that we mentioned, Europe demonstrated resilience and Europe stayed strong and united in front of all these challenges. And now I would like to ask you, do you think this your assessment, does it still fit to 2023 assessment? And what are your main takeaways from the past year? Jean-Louis?
Thank you very much, Violeta. First of all, I want to really thank you and ICMPD for having me again for the 4th time. I find that a very privileged occasion to take stock with you and in front of a very wide audience. So we have to be up to the challenge. As far as last year is concerned, I would say when it comes to migration, I have mainly 2 takeaways. First, an absolute record number of asylum seekers in the EU. Second, an absolute record number of forced displacement worldwide. Not necessarily migration, but also internal displacement. Sudan is an example. Latin America with the Venezuelan caseload is another example. And we could refer to many of these situations. As the EU demonstrated resilience, I would say yes. It has, as usual, muddled through. Look at the way the enlargement process was prepared. There was a first deliberation in June granting candidate status to Moldova and Ukraine, and with strings attached, looking positively as the application of Georgia. And then in December, the decision was taken that indeed enlargement negotiation would start. So it's there. Of course, you would say, but well, look at what happened around Gaza. There, I must say, we have to take into account history. The situation in the Middle East has always deeply divided the member states for historical reasons, I would say. And of course, the terrorist attack that took place on the 7th of October and the consequences of that, by no means it could have been expected that the EU would have taken a united position with regard to what was happening. Member states were structurally, historically divided. They are still historically divided. And of course, one has to acknowledge that when it comes to the Middle East, the EU is irrelevant. Will that unity stay? There will be another drama Thursday this week in Brussels concerning the midterm review of the financial forecast. There is a lot of muscle showings with one member state playing, or at least one head of state playing its usual troublemaker role. Well, by the way, the incoming presidency of the EU. But my best guess is that, a solution will be found. So it's not always easy. There are disagreements. Some of them cannot be surmounted, and we have to acknowledge that. Some others are, and indeed that confirms what I still see as, I would say, the resilience of the EU, stronger together. What is to be expected And no, what I would add to that, if you allow me, is if the EU is resilient when it comes to crisis, the EU is not there yet when it comes to anticipation. Take the example of Gaza and its consequences in terms of movement of persons. It has been with us since the 7th of October. So when it comes to anticipation of crisis, the EU is still notoriously bad. You know that foresighters, people involved in foresight activities, used to label black swans totally unprecedented and unforeseeable event. The Russian aggression against Ukraine was everything but a black swan. The drama in the Middle East was everything but a black swan. Of course, I mean, it has taken unprecedented proportion because of the violence of the terrorist attack of the 7th of October, but everything was there to see the situation deteriorating as it has deteriorated. Everything is still there to have a further deterioration of the situation in the Middle East is perfectly foreseeable. Unprecedented diplomatic efforts are made by, for instance, the United States and others in the region to prevent that, war between Israel and Hamas to become something much bigger in the region, but the danger is there. If it materializes, that will provoke unprecedented migration flows towards Cyprus, towards Egypt, towards other countries in the region. Are we prepared to cater for that? No, we are not. So just as an example, last but not least, but we'll come back on that indeed. I would support what Ralph said about the political agreement reached on the pact. It took a lot of efforts, and I think that we owe a big thank to the Spanish presidency and to Spain, because we have to bear in mind that their presidency started at the time they were still digesting the outcome of the July election. So they managed. Now, a lot has still to be done, but we'll come back on that later during the conversation. But that is again demonstrating that at EU level, when there is a will, there is always a way. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. And yes, we will dedicate some time also to speak about the pact and the future of this very important instrument. But now I would like to stay a little bit longer on the EU enlargement. You yourself, Jean-Louis, I will stay with you now. You mentioned during our last year Vienna Migration Conference, another ICMPD's annual flagship initiative, where you participated at the panel dedicated to the vision of Europe. You mentioned that you cannot imagine that the European Council in December will end and there will be no accession negotiations started with Ukraine and Moldova. And you have just mentioned that actually the Council delivered more. The negotiation for accession started with both countries. Also, the candidate status for Georgia was approved. And also there was a decision to call for the acceleration of the accession of the 3 Western Balkan countries. And now you also often refer to these decisions as historic decisions. And I would like to ask you, what do you think, in your opinion, what are the accession perspectives of 3 Eastern European countries and 3 Western Balkan ones? And what is the importance of this decision?
Thank you. Indeed, the process was launched in December. Let me just stress that the accession negotiation have not started yet. Well, by the way, there was a bit of an hiccup because apparently the Commission was slow in launching the screening process in Moldova and Ukraine. There were some criticism expressed by member states, but okay. The ball is now rolling. But the question is now how to do it. How to do it. Some guidance from the Commission is expected during the semester, but most probably the accession process framework will be decided upon and set later in the year, most probably when the new Commission and the new European Parliament will be in place following the European election on the 9th of June. There will, of course, there is the classical accession negotiation that should be amended. Well, you know that I do not like to use the word negotiation because accession process is not a negotiation. It's a ticking box exercise. The performance of the candidate countries when meeting a certain number of criteria by clusters are assessed by the Commission. The Commission reports back to the Council, the Member States, which decides by unanimity if it is okay or not. So there is very little to negotiate as such. But okay, let's leave that aside for the time being. So there is this process, and everybody, all Member States are insisting on the fact that, I mean, it's a merit-based process. There will not be some kind of speedy or accelerated process, and many criticisms were expressed once after the President of the European Council referred to 2030 as a possible date for the end game. So it's going to be a merit-based process. Now the question is that enough? Because of course, I mean, every accession negotiation, every enlargement decision, is always a political decision. Look at the history of the successive enlargement of the Union, including the one of 2004. We'll celebrate the 20th anniversary of this Big Bang enlargement later during the semester of the Belgian presidency. All decisions concerning enlargement were always based on political or strategic consideration. So this is again the case. But once decision is taken, it has to be implemented. It will require tremendous efforts from both sides. From the side of the EU, I am convinced that we're going to have to, adapt the way of working, the structure, the processes of the EU. It is partly related to enlargement because, the institutional structure which is now governing the EU is inherited from the Rome Treaty 1958. We are nowadays in 2024. So by definition, even without enlargement, I think that the EU has reached a point when it should dedicate serious thinking about what it does and how it works. But even more now that we have the enlargement, this will become a necessity. The relation between enlargement and that kind of in-house reform is still to be determined. Many member states, including the one I know best and the one which is holding the rotating presidency, i.e. Belgium, have always defended the mantra, no enlargement without deepening. Fine, but once you say that, how do you link the two processes? One thing is for sure is that the worst possible message to the candidate countries, either the new one or those already in the pipeline, would be to say, wait, we still have to achieve our internal reform process, and then we'll talk to you about enlargement and you becoming member states. Because everybody knows that this internal reform exercise will take time, it will be long, it will be difficult, mostly if it entails treaty reforms. So we have to find a way to run the two processes in parallel and in a way that it is not too detrimental to the situation of candidate countries. what the EU cannot afford anymore is what has happened since 20 years with some of those still in the pipeline. That is to say, to keep on raising false expectation. That's, I would say, the worst possible way to handle enlargement process. We have to be serious. That is to say that we have to find a way to manage the enlargement that makes that candidate countries do not have to wait for 20 years in a kind of waiting room until the last dot, until the last comma is put at the end of the enlargement process, but must be rewarded en route for all the efforts that they have been done. They have been doing. So that's where a certain number of concepts and notions which have been elaborated by think tanks, by experts, like differentiated integration, gradual accession, all that should now be factored into the process. So that the accession process, the enlargement process is a dynamic one. I mean, that people actually see that things are moving while safeguarding the decision-making capacity, the agility of the EU, its capacity to respond to the needs of its member states and of the citizens of these member states. Because if this is not safeguarded, then what would be the point for the candidate countries to become member states, to become member of a regional structure which has become dysfunctional because it did not adapt itself to the new reality? That's the challenge for the year to come.
Thanks a lot for this assessment, and indeed it has to do a lot with the expectations management on both sides, on the EU side and the candidate countries. Ralph, what is your view on this, the same decision, and do you think it also has something to do with migration mobility policies? What do you think?
No, I think the key point, as Jean-Louis just said, I mean, there's a lot about expectation management and keeping this balance also in terms of messaging to the citizens in the countries. I mean, one thing are the authorities, the political elites, to have the screening, as you said, Jean-Louis, sort of, it's really ticking the box, which means, I mean, passing an extraordinary number of laws, legislation through parliaments and so on. And in the end, it is quite a, I would even call it a transformational exercise, and goes very deep into administrative structures and so on. But also then the impact on citizens. And I think there, with a timeline, where is always room for a lot of frustration, but on both sides. And I think I mean we see that already in the last days and weeks. I mean, not in the enlarging countries, but when we look at what the sentiment for the need for protest in European countries at the moment, when it comes also in relation to, on the one hand, I think a big big agreement for support actually for Ukraine, but then we see when it comes to agricultural policy, the grain issue and so on, where there are concerns in the European countries among Europeans. So to keep everybody on board, so that, as again Jean-Louis spoke about, the EU being dysfunctional, there is something which is really key to bring everyone together. And I think when it comes then to migration and mobility, it also shows, as always, I think we have to underline, I mean, migration and mobility is just one aspect. I mean, we focus on it, but it is influenced by so many other things. I mean, geopolitical developments we pointed out, but I think here other, I mean, especially the economic situation. And I just saw, I think last year when the Commission or the EU launched the growth plan for the Western Balkans, I think it's also key to see in which kind of economic situation we can speak about doing reforms. Which again, as I said before, impact the acceptance, I think, in the population among the citizens. I think then for us in ICMPD, it's interesting. I mean, 5 years ago, we came out with recommendations for this commission, and we had already one point on the Western Balkans actually, and we argued for sort of I mean, to integrate wherever possible prior to any enlargement, I mean, the Western Balkan countries in different discussion fora, in even at minister level. I mean, all these fora and different settings exist. And I think that is absolutely key. And it's being done right now. European Migration Network is opening, I mean, is opened up to, I think, to candidate countries and so on. That these opportunities are intensified, that they are used, that this sort of sitting together and embracing the country. It's not only because otherwise it's very much, and there's the risk that it's only seen, one dictates and the other one is ticking the box, and it is a very sort of technical exercise. It is, and I said legislation in many areas, but there's more to it. That is, I would call it, there's also, you have to create the, with regard to the atmosphere and being part of it, and that only goes when all, and for us in migration issues or asylum issues, that it's really the various fora are opened up. It's facilitated that in the Western Balkans we work with all the EU tools, and the agencies are already there. But then when we implement projects, we are there with the member states, that we have sort of these peer-to-peer elements when we are implementing. I think that is hugely important, and that I think also, I mean, when we take the Western Balkans, but all the countries, it's not anymore that we see them as it's either sort of a transit zone, only people are transiting, or actually also a lot, some of the countries as a source for labor migration, and there's still a will and demand for labor migration, but I think, many say already, well, that is enough. I mean, so many have already left. So that has to change to a view that each and every country of the candidate countries and have to build up fully functioning asylum and migration system. And in that context, I think now will also be, the next 2 years will be the challenge actually to anticipate what will be the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. And I think there's also something, again, to be done for the EU, and that is to, right from the beginning, work also with the enlargement countries to explain the pact, to see which implications that has, and so on. And the last point, just to say that when we speak about candidate countries, not to forget as well, according to the status, we also have Turkey with the status of the candidate country. That is a discussion on its own. There are, and so on, but I think we should keep that when we speak about candidate countries. We also have to have on our list for discussion and considerations also Turkey.
Indeed, thanks a lot for also bringing Turkey to this debate discussion. But now you both mentioned EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, and let's also speak about that and broadly on European migration agenda. 2024 is already framed as the biggest election year in the history. About 2 billion people will be invited to vote in this year, and also the 2024 migration outlook of ICMPD also refers to this intervening of politics and migration, because more and more we see that migration plays one of the key roles in the election debate. We will elect new European Parliament in June 2024. Some EU member states will have state elections or municipal elections. Also, EU candidate countries that we just discussed, Georgia, Moldova, and also North Macedonia, will have elections in this year. So, Ralph, I would start with you now. How do you see this dynamic of intervening between politics and migration unfold across the EU member states, and how it would influence the ongoing already now migration policy debate at the EU level?
Well, I think the first thing to say about elections, that elections are good. because sometimes when you look at there are so many elections coming, sometimes one can get the impression to say, "Ooh, that is a danger." Now, whatever is the outcome then on the elections, I mean, it is the core. There are many cores of democratic states and societies, but certainly free and fair elections are key to it. So we should be looking forward to that, actually. Now, absolutely, there's a lot of speculation and discussions on what that will mean. Certainly here in Brussels, I mean, the elections of the European Parliament, and then following that, the composition of the European Commission and so on, is very close to us. But then also Belgium also has elections, so it's not only for the European institutions when we are sitting here in Brussels. Now it's clear that migration in many countries plays a role, and often plays a role, which leads to friction, polarization, and I think that is one of the biggest dangers that, and I think that is regrettable, that among certain parts of the political elite there is this will to ever more polarize, which leads then to fragmentation of societies. And we spoke about resilience at the EU level, but we have to speak about the resilience of our societies to see where do they come together to follow sort of, the common agreement of a democratic path. So there, I mean, that which role plays migration in elections? I mean, I think that's, to put that in a nutshell. Now it will be, let's see, everybody said, well, it will be, would be a devastating effect if the EU, could not agree on an EU Pact. Now it had, 20th of December when the political agreement was reached. I think no one really paid attention to what comes out of the EU just before sort of the Christmas break and so on. But anyway, I mean, at the moment we only have the political agreement. It still needs the formalization, the, let's say, legislation of everything, and that is happening now. With we spoke in the enlargement process about legislation and thousands of pages of legislation and documents. So that's the same also for the pact. And I think what has to continue to happen at both at EU level and at national level is this, in terms of political messaging, but also initiatives to show that administrations and the politicians are on top of the topic of migration. And Jean-Louis spoke before about sort of foresight. It can't be reactive. I mean, very often it's reactive. We see the figures, we have to adapt. Well, no, we have to some extent expect figures and flows, and have to, and also to, in terms of political messaging, to show to the citizens that that this can be handled. I'm avoiding the word managed, or because there's so much discussion on it, but this can be handled in terms of resources, administrative capacity, but also new ideas. And if there are new ideas, new initiatives, and here I come back to the EU Pact, and we will see that with the new European Commission, how it will be anchored there. It's actually not the end. It's, to some extent, it's the end of a certain process, but it's actually the start of everything. If now this pact is not properly implemented, and it would be a devastating message. It's all about implementation. My understanding also is that within what is being agreed, there are sort of implementation deadlines and so on. It takes time, but we are in the EU, so this interplay between the EU level and member state level will be absolutely crucial. And in the end, it will also be a test case for for the trust, which I think through agreeing, you try to build trust at least. Will that hold? Because if it's not holding, then we have again the situation where a member state will say, we are delayed or we are not implementing, and we bring it back to a political discussion. So the point is really, I think, to understand if we have now the formal agreement, hopefully soon, that is actually, it's not the end, it's actually the starting point for what should and must happen with what is in the pact. And that doesn't mean that certain provisions can't be adapted or improved, or we speak about compromise, we're in the EU. So and I think the understanding must be it is a complex exercise with the interplay national level, EU level. The other thing to say, I think, with the pact, with elections, I said at the very beginning, I see it very positive that Europe comes to terms with the issue of labor migration. Not everybody, but that we recognize that the need is there in so many sectors. We see that in everyday life. Now, labor migration and immigration is not the solution to every need on the labor market. Let's be clear, and I'm not saying that, but it's a contribution to finding solutions there. Other measures at the national level on skilling, upskilling, and looking at those who do not actively participate to the labor market have to be found as well. But here we speak about the contribution labor migration can make. So with the focus on the implementation of the pact and the legislation, which is mainly about asylum and irregular migration, let's not lose sight also on achieving progress in the area of labor migration, national competence, and with a few in the EU, with a few initiatives which are being negotiated still at the EU level at the moment. But also in November, we had the communication from the European Commission on skills, sort of the skills package. And just to say that I think we are now, and that is a good, from a migration point of view, I think that is a good moment that there is the readiness to talk about both irregular migration and asylum, but on the other hand, also labor migration. And I'm not saying that this sort of, when we are talking about migration flows, it's a one-to-one, because there are certain offers on labor migration. We will see an immediate decrease on the irregular migration. I think that research has shown it's by far more complex, but it's just our reality. And still in our discussions as well with third countries, it has to be part of it. And that must also be clear, and politicians can't ignore that anymore, the needs. And I think that is what we are seeing as well. Now, how to give that message in election campaigns is a difficult one, and especially not to mix everything. As I said in the beginning, to not fall into the trap of polarization and fragmentation. I think that's the worst thing which can happen to our societies.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Now I would turn to you, Jean-Louis, and agreeing with what Ralph said, that elections are in general a good thing, that public debate or election debate on migration is a good thing. We also agree that the electorate has the legitimate expectations from the politicians that they would find that solution. So my question is really short to you. Do you think the pact is the solution to the migration challenges or not?
I would like maybe first, there was a lot in what Ralph said, but I would like to dwell 1 second on the election challenge that was your previous question. I think that it's of the utmost importance, and the three of us will have said that, to repeat that free and fair elections are a good thing. That means also that we have to accept the outcome of these elections, whatever it is. Let me focus 1 second on the European election. I mean, the most important outcome or the most important figure to look at in the evening of the 9th of June will be the turnout. Will people go to the polls and will they vote? That is the first challenge. Then, of course, I mean, if we want the people to go to the poll and if we expect them to make the right choice, we have to explain. We have to defend. Let me take two examples which are not migration related. Climate change policy and the ongoing reaction of farmers in many of our member states. Of course, I mean, we have to take action and we have to adopt new measures, new legislation, but also implement them, which would help mitigate the consequence of ongoing climate change. Nowadays, in some regions of Spain, they are already at 30 degrees centigrade, and we are at the end of January. So this is not to be put in doubt, but it's very easy in this transition period where people, you, me, will have first to pay the price, because there is no such thing as a free meal, for this transition to be a success. It's so easy to go to them, to go to us and say, what's the point? I mean, these people in Brussels, they do not listen to you. I mean, they are obsessed by their targets, which they are not going to meet anyway. And you are asked to pay the price. So that must be contradicted. There must be leadership explaining, yes, that indeed, maybe we might need more transition. We might need a longer transition, but that the headline goal is a common good. Second example, coming back to what we just discussed, enlargement. We are all convinced that enlargement is a good thing. That the 2004 enlargement shows that even if it could have been run in a better way, at the end of the day, enlargement ends up being a win-win scenario for the former candidate countries and win scenario for the EU, which is reinforced. For instance, just this economic cloud is reinforced thanks to the enlarged internal market. Fine. But it would be very easy in the present circumstances to go to the people who are supposed to vote and say, are you really willing to pay more taxes to allow the Ukrainians to become EU citizens? Not difficult. Look at the ongoing debate in the US Congress. So again, we'll need political leadership to go to the voters and explain them that, yes, indeed, the EU will be stronger after having been enlarged to those who are nowadays in the waiting line, that there might be a price to pay for that, but at the end of the process, this is a win-win scenario for everybody. So we need to go to the voters. I mean, political leaders need to go to the voters and defend the choices that they are promoting. If they are not convincing enough, then of course, we might have a political landscape in the European Parliament that is different from the one that we have today, but we're going to have to live with it. And we're going to have to live with it during the next 5 years. Now, when it comes to migration, I'm a little bit more cautious there. Precisely because of what Ralph said, this is nowadays a completely polarized debate. I mean, it's almost impossible. After all these years, I'm now giving up to defend a rational adult debate and discussion about migration. But I would go even further than that. We all know that one way or another, European elections are also national elections, even in countries where, contrary to Belgium, the two are not coupled together. I am unfortunately betting today that if during the 4 or 5 weeks preceding the election, there is the slightest migration-related incident in countries like France, of Germany, take the AfD, for instance, it will have unprecedented consequences of the outcome of the election, because this has become completely emotional, this has become completely irrational. Whether there is a pact or not, in all fairness, having a pact is a good thing, but I've never been convinced by the argument of those saying, okay, if we go to the election without a pact, that will be a drama. The risk of a drama is still there, even with a pact. On the top of that, I have to say that the EU public opinion is vaguely informed about what these pacts means, what it will entail, what the consequences are going to be. What they see is that the number of asylum seekers is growing, that the number of people dying in the sea, look at the latest press release of the IOM, is increasing by the year, that they are still, I mean, they feel that, I mean, I see these notions of absorption capacity coming back, that they are overwhelmed, that anyway the asylum seekers reception systems are cracking. Look at the situation in the Netherlands, in Belgium, or in Ireland. So all that has very little influence on the very irrational approach of migration, which is the one of still large chunk of our population, of our citizens, and unfortunately of many of our political leaders.
Now I would move to the final round of questions because we speak almost 1 hour here. I would like to come back to the displacement of Ukrainians that we did not really discuss much in details today. Now we enter the last year of the temporary protection validity according to the directive. It cannot be prolonged further than March 2025. And we don't see, unfortunately, we don't see the war ending soon. And even if this would happen, that we all hope for, it's still a long way until the Ukrainian displaced people could safely return home. In addition, also knowing the profile of Ukrainian displaced people, with mainly women with children, it is also safe to expect that they would stay for some time in Europe, just also because they entered employment, children enter now the 3rd year of education in the European schools, and many other things. On the other hand, also when war is over, Ukraine will be in great need of people to return back. They would rather prefer to see family reunification in Ukraine than the European Union. It also can happen that we in Europe will compete for the same skills, the same qualifications of people, of Ukrainians who are now here and could participate in the labor market. But Ukraine wants them to return back when the war is over. So many questions here, but Ralph, I would like to ask you a specific thing. In what direction do you think the future of temporary protection will be decided at the EU level? And do you think that Europe will still stay united beyond March 2025? Will be that unified decisions or not?
Well, on Ukraine, actually, Violetta, you should speak on Ukraine. You're dealing with that on a daily basis. Now, I think the first thing to say is now it's already good. I mean, we have the extension of temporary protection. It was decided then in October by the Council until 4th of March 2025. I think what I see at the moment from the discussions that sort of the favored solution would be for further extension of temporary protection. Again, it's not decided, and I mean it was on the agenda of the informal council last week. But this discussion is ongoing, and I think the Commission, but also many member states, have sympathy for that. But then I think one has to underline it's still called temporary protection. So in the inherent logic is it can't be also extended forever. Now, from my side, I think it's also important to remind. I mean, even an extension at the moment, we have sort of stability and security. I mean, stability with that regard to that protection regime until 4th of March 2025. That's not so long into the new mandate of the European Parliament or the European Commission. So I think a quite early signs or decision on what happens, at least for the next 6 months or a year after March 2025. Personally, I would actually welcome that, just to have sort of more stability there, because until all the bits and pieces of what makes European politics is institutionally in place. That's one consideration. I think the other consideration which we have to see, and we say it in our migration outlook, we call it actually that this year, 2024 should be a pivotal year for economic integration of Ukrainians, Ukraine beneficiaries for temporary protection. It ranges from 17 to 77%. And I mean, you mentioned it, it depends very much on the profile of people and also which kind of jobs and so on. But that will be, I think we will see an increase in that. I think that is also in other displacement situations with time. You see that. I mean, the integration that is something natural, and certainly that this transition from the temporary protection scheme to longer term, which I rather see on the legal labor or legal migration provisions which exist in member states. I think that is what has to be worked out in an EU context. And let's also not only say EU, let's also take, for instance, Switzerland or others who are not in the EU, but so that we avoid secondary movements or discussions and so on. I think, and that classically at the EU level goes through strong coordination and exchange, because, well, legal, if it's not directly, I mean, if it's doesn't have to be regulated through EU law, but I mean, this coordination because already today we see differences in approaches. I think at the member state level. I mean, one of the reasons of temporary protection was not to overwhelm the asylum systems. So to have people back in the asylum system, I don't think that is a good idea, and I think there's a little appetite for that. I think there's one sort of an interesting reflection out there, and that is for the mid or longer term to have provisions in place which reflect the reality of the geographic proximity, for instance, and the close coordination which is also taking place with Ukraine. So to allow for these, again, often in these moments, very natural back and forth movements. Because very often in migration, it's either you are in this country or you're in that country. You have this status or you have that status. Now, I think what I read, some argued, well, one could get inspiration from sort of Brexit provisions, what happened and so on. Again, if it goes too much into legislation at the EU level, then it's probably, again, less appetite there. Is it feasible? Is it not feasible? I don't know, but I think it will happen anyway. And it's happening already today. I think geographic proximity is just a reality, especially in that case. So back and forth movements are happening. Can we do that? That there's no doubt about that, and what could be raised to perceptions that it is not 100% conform with whatever status persons have in the mid and long term. I think that would be interesting. Yeah, but that is something I think might need and more studying and reflection. And the other point, I think to underline, and what is interesting when we speak about status, and it's happening actually, the close coordination between the EU discussions and also Ukraine. I think that is very good and not that usual in cases of a massive displacement, because it is of course linked to also the question of actually a return of Ukrainians to their country.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Yes, Ukraine is one of our key projects here, and area where we work really a lot, not only in our region, but also in our policy directorate, and of course in the Prague Process Secretariat, where we have also discussions with the EU member states on possible scenarios, and also have released a number of publications. You can also find them on the Prague Process and the ICMPD website. Jean-Louis, what is your take on this question? And also probably bringing it, we did not discuss labor migration much, probably also you could share your assessment with regard to the potential competition between Europe and Ukraine on labor migrants.
Yes, I'm time conscious indeed, and we are now getting to near to the last part of our conversation this morning. So I will first spare you any comment on the pact. I was pretty much in line with many things that Ralph said, and if you allow me a bit of self-advertisement, if our colleagues in the audience are sleepless at night, I would recommend them the reading of the commentary on the pact that we published yesterday on Egmont website, together with my colleague Eleonora Milazzo. Similarly, self-advertising. We are convening on the 15th of February in our premises in Brussels a meeting with Lodewijk Asscher. Lodewijk Asscher is a former Dutch vice prime minister, and he was the special envoy of the Commission, i.e. Commissioner Nicolas Schmit, and he prepared a report that was last year about the integration of Ukrainians into EU labor market, and that will be good opportunity to discuss exactly what the issues that we are raising today. I was appalled, I have to say, by what I read, the press release that I read after the informal meeting of Justice and Home Affairs ministers the day before yesterday, or last week, sorry, in Brussels. They discussed indeed for the first time what next after the temporary protection. And I read two sentences. First of all, it's better to find a common solution that to go, each member state to go its own way. Fine. Yes. And second, we'll do that together with the Ukrainian government. Fine. What does that mean? And well, I mean, in all fairness, Ralph, I listened very carefully to what you said, and seemingly you are well connected, but the clock is ticking. I mean, I don't so sure that you are that we could get off this situation without a bit of legislation. I mean, the Parliament will not be there between April and, well, basically September, October. And September, October, it will be very busy because of the hearings of the designated commissioner. I mean, so whether we go for a prolongation of the temporary protection, or if we go for some other forms of legislation, and you know, for instance, that I've always been a supporter of the idea of lowering to 3 years the threshold to get long-term resident status. I mean, this is on the table of the Council for the time being, and that could be a nice way to offer the Ukrainians the possibility to move to one legal situation, from one legal situation to another. But okay, I think that, I mean, the way out, I mean, I said earlier, if there is a will, there's a way. There is seemingly a will, but therefore the way must be designed and decided upon at very short notice so that it could start being implemented and enter into force at the right moment. All the more that we have also to think about these 4 million something Ukrainians still on EU member states territory. I mean, these neighbors, these friends of ours must know what their situation will be after March of next year. Their employers must know what their situation is going to be. The landlords must know what the situation is going to be. I mean, what about the schooling of their children when school will begin in September? What is going to happen? So, I mean, a decision must be taken in principle on what framework will be offered to them if indeed they are not able to return in safe and dignified conditions in Ukraine from March 2025 onwards. Now, if it is a protection solution, then okay, if we go for an extension of the temporary protection, we have to be aware that it will completely change the very nature of the temporary protection. Temporary protection was meant, and it was said time and again by the Commission, not that much to protect the people needing protection, but also to be a shield protecting the national asylum system, which would not be able to cope with a mass influx of people in need of protection. If we move from to something different, that means that the very nature of the temporary protection will change, will be adapted. We might think, for instance, in terms of solutions like the one which are implemented in Ecuador or Colombia for the Venezuelan, which are granted a so-called temporary protection status, which has nothing to do with our temporary protection, and which is kind of a gray zone between migration status and protection status. But that has to be invented, and that would need a legal framework. I have very serious doubts about the possibility to, I mean, find any kind of settlement, and we need a settlement, we need a kind of solution without something being done in terms of legislation or regulation. And that must be decided, I would say, in the next 2 months, so that it is implemented in time during the second half of the year, and that Ukrainians know exactly where their situation is going to be once the milestone of March 2025 will have been reached. It's part of my growing concern about what I see as the shrinking of the protection space in the EU. We are still bound by the Geneva Convention. We are still bound by a set of existing EU legislation which have been adopted concerning qualification, concerning procedures, concerning reception condition. And we behave as if all that did not exist. That is, I would say, my first concern. We are not up to, I would say, our own standards when it comes to either granting protection or even dealing with the situation of individuals asking for protection, because asking for protection is an individual right according to international law. And I think that I'm concerned by the fact that we are more and more economical with that fundamental principle. External processing is anything but a new idea. I mean, in my very old days, in the very early moments of following the temporary council conclusion, when we were taking the first step which were supposed to lead to the setting up of a common European asylum system, there were already voices or ideas being circulated about external processing. I mean, the target was at the time the southern rim of the Mediterranean, and the ideas being floated were closed to what seemingly Italy wants to achieve with Albania nowadays. We were stonewalled because one way or another, if we wished the EU and the international protection standards to be met, that meant some kind of extraterritoriality for the areas where asylum claims would have been processed outside the EU. Rwanda saga, I mean, well, look at the daily press releases in the United Kingdom for the time being. I mean, it's again politics much more than policy. Last thing I've heard was that 4 Rwandan citizens were now granted asylum in the United Kingdom because obviously, seemingly, that demonstrates that Rwanda is not such a safe third country or a country where asylum could be processed safely. So all that, I mean, I'm extremely reluctant to engage into that discussion. Again, it's about politics. It's about, I mean, selling solutions which are not solutions. Maybe the solution is in the proper implementation of the pact, but we'll know more about that 2 years from now. Maybe something else must be designed, but it is high time that, and again, I refer to my call for political leadership. I mean, we are reminded, national authorities are reminded of our international obligation when it comes to granting protection to those who need it. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
Yeah, no, I think the first point, because often it's sort of portrayed as if it's a sort of new discussion and so on. Absolutely. I mean, let's go back. I mean, the discussion initiatives for this kind of thinking, I mean, has always been there. And now, from my side, I have to say, I don't mind the thinking about it. I have not yet been. I've not yet been convinced for many reasons. I mean, we have, as Jean-Louis said, we have a international legal framework. We have international commitments and EU legislation and EU legislation in Europe. how we deal with that is also a very strong sign to other countries in the world who we ask actually to also live up to their international commitments, and in the end also say, well, you have to take in people if there is a crisis. So there are, the other point which is always put forward that, be it here, be it somewhere else, if we speak about asylum processing, we would have a yes. To put it very simple, a yes or a no. If we have a no, we have to deal with with return and reintegration. So why this is then better somewhere else than with us? Also, it's one of the regular sort of points which is mentioned in these contexts, in these discussions. So again, to have at the moment a broad discussion, including that topic, I'm not against now, to look at these initiatives. But I think, of what we want to respect in Europe, what we have to respect in terms of legal framework, that is absolutely key. But then also the consideration, and there, I think we don't go far enough in terms of imagining what that could mean for also a partner country with which we want to discuss that. Because also on their side, their population is most likely concerned about the topic of migration. It plays also in their discussions a big role, criticism to the government and so on. So the impact of that in another country is actually can well be very high and even impact stability of countries. So there are many things to be considered. And also last point here, I think to be very clear of what we are talking about, I think, because is it really extraterritorial processing, or is it, then very quickly it's sort of thrown into a pact or a deal with countries, or what is more actually could more be described as protection in the region, which I think is actually something which is very natural, that we have to strengthen those countries which are very close to a country in crisis. But also here, Jean-Louis said before, it is very difficult to have a serious discussion on migration where probably we're not mixing everything and throwing everything in the same pot. But the discussions on external processing, they will continue. They are continuing. They are there. But one has to critically look at what is put there on the table. I think we have to look at where we stand on, what is called the external dimension relations with countries, the EU or national level we want to work with. So is it pressure? Is it diplomatic relations, defending interest? I think, but it is clear that the EU and member states and it's actually not an EU topic. You can take any destination country in the world, and that country will want to have a conversation with countries of origin and transit. So it's not an EU topic. I think that is something it's also important to underline. But still, but I think what we have clearly seen, and that is also the commitment by ICMPD, that I think the experience is that if we have a narrow discussion on purely migration issues, it's unlikely that much will happen in sort of the understanding. So it's a broader thinking. It's about, and then it is very country specific sort of models. I'm very skeptical in that. I think each country is quite unique in terms of historic relations, possibly with the EU, but also with the socioeconomic situation, economic development and so on, what is needed. So, but there is no alternative to that discussion and these diplomatic relations where migration plays a role, if that is the case. At the recent event, the vice president of the Commission, Skinas, he said it's about 25 countries for the EU in the world. One would have to we will need to good relations when it comes to migration. There is no alternative to that. I think how you do it, I think there's now many lessons learned. If there's a feeling on the other side and only sort of pressure, it's all about perception and the political climate and so on. It's yes, but still it's defending interest as much as the countries on the other side. They also have their interests. And there are many countries in the world, they are very able negotiators and they have legitimate interests. And will make that feel to the European Union on European countries. And that is also, we spoke about the future, the pact and so on, this external dimension, the talking with the partner countries will have to be done at least as intensively as it has been done now in the last years.
Thanks a lot. Jean-Louis, what would you add here?
I'm notoriously critical when it comes to the external dimension of the EU migration policy. I would subscribe largely to what Ralph said. But there are examples of the way this should be achieved. And I'm referring to the Italian policy these days. There was, and it went largely under the radar screen, there was during the summer in July, a conference convened by President of the Council Meloni, a so-called Migration and Development Conference. And I would recommend everybody the reading of the final communique of this conference, which is the first text that I saw for a long time, where migration-related concerns were plugged at the right place in a much broader agenda, referring to a series of existing framework of cooperation in other policy areas. There was yesterday this conference in Rome, which is pointing in the same direction of a comprehensive approach, of a comprehensive relation with countries, which happens to be countries of origin and transit, but which are also partners on many other different counts. There is a very interesting initiative which is now promoted by the EU, which has been promoted, which is there for 2 years, which is the so-called Global Gateway Initiative, which aims at promoting investment in third countries, which would benefit both to the local economies, but also to the EU. And by the way, as I know that many of our colleagues in the audience are coming from this country, Central Asian Republic are one of the main targets of this global gateway policy. But it allows me still to make the link with something that I did not elaborate upon, rather the issue of labor migration. There was a Global Gateway summit in Brussels last October, which I attended. And in many of the sessions dedicated to these initiatives in different policy sectors, health, transport, so on and so forth, the same mantra came again and again and again. What makes an investment in a third country successful? It's rules, standards, a local market, and skills. So that should make us think about labor migration, because it might also be the case that after all, the skills that we would like to attract in our famous race for talents might be needed in the countries where they are, and that instead of bringing reasonably educated young people from Senegal to the EU to work in the health sector, we might train them in Senegal to develop one of the main health-related initiatives in the framework of the Global Gateway program that will take place in Senegal. All that must be factored into this broader approach that Ralph was advocating. But again, it's possible, it's doable, but the lead must not by any means be given to the ministers of interior, even if we all know, you referred, Violetta, in your question to the pact, that indeed, if at the end of the pact process, the procedure which is set by the pact, return and reintegration do not function, we have a problem. We have a problem, obviously. So we have to really take that into account. I would end this intervention by quoting, you probably heard that former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta has been tasked by the EU to draft a report on the future of the internal market. And interestingly enough, and it has to do with something that Ralph said earlier in the conversation, he's now floating the idea that people should have the right to stay where they are, not be compelled to move because of economic imbalances, because of different market opportunities. So what is, I don't know if this will survive in the final version of his report, but he already expressed that in several occasions. But what could become, I would say, a principle that should be defended inside the EU could also guide our policy when dealing with third country. One last comment. I say that it was the last. We should also bear in mind the demography issue. It's not only about labor market, it's about a demography issue. Demography is not foresight, it's forecast. We know that babies who are not born today are not, who are not born today are not going to be adults in 25 years from now. Sorry, I know that what I just said sounds stupid. But mind you, in 2050, the EU 27 population will represent less than 4% of the world population. Less than 4% of the world population in 2050. So we have to factor the demographic situation into our overall approach of, flows of people, displacement, migration, from all kinds of reasons, one way or another, inside or outside the EU.
Thank you very much to both of you, not only for answering these two questions from the audience, but also for the entire policy talk. And once again, we covered many different questions on internal EU migration policy to external dimension. And once again, also to demonstrate how much migration is related to different policy areas. Just now, the demography was mentioned at the end. And thanks a lot, Jean-Louis, for this, your final remarks here. Yes, thank you very much. And I hope to see you next year here.